My name is Monn Ginsburg, and I am the president of NCJW Minnesota. My pronouns are she and her. The National Council of Jewish Women is launching a weekly webinar series to give our advocates across the country tools to stay connected to NCJW, reframe our work, and advance the Jewish values that inspire our efforts. In Judaism, pekuach nefesh, saving lives, takes precedence over pretty much everything else we might do. And right now, that means coming together online instead of in person to limit the spread of COVID-19. We are kicking off the NCJW webinar series today and will continue every Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern, 1:30 p.m. Pacific through May 5th. The series will be recorded, posted online, and shared widely for those who cannot attend in person. It will include advocacy, service, technical assistance, and paths to staying connected during these trying times. Thank you again for choosing to spend your time with us today. I sincerely hope that you and your loved ones are staying well, and if not, can get the care that you need. Now, back to our webinar, which I will importantly mention is off the record for press. The current pandemic we are in changes how we engage others in voting, and perhaps the very way we even vote. Today, we are joined by a number of exciting speakers whom I will introduce in a moment. First, a couple of quick housekeeping items. You will notice that everyone's mics are muted and cameras are turned off. This is intentional to keep the focus on our speakers as they speak. You should feel free to write down questions you have or drop them in the chat box or Q&A box as we go. Our agenda is very tight today, so we won't have time for Q&A. However, NCJW staff will respond to you via chat or email you after the webinar. You can reach out to Ari A. Solomon at ncjw.org or write in the chat if you have any ongoing technical issues. We will do our very best to address anything that you're experiencing. And a quick reminder again that we are recording and will upload this to our website just as soon as we can. Today we are thrilled, and I am honestly verklempt, to be joined by Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, my home state, and Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. Senator Amy Klobuchar is the first woman elected to represent the state of Minnesota in the United States Senate. She led the effort to pass landmark pieces of legislation to end human trafficking and to combat the opioid epidemic. Among her many committee assignments and leadership roles, Senator Klobuchar is the ranking member of the Senate Rules Committee, where she works to ensure fairness, transparency, and efficiency in government. She helped pass the most sweeping ethics reform since Watergate and has authored legislation to boost same-day voter registration, which Minnesota has had in place for many years, and as a result, our state has one of the highest voter turnout rates in the country. Senator Ron Wyden began his work in public service, founding the Oregon chapter of Gray Panthers, an advocacy group for the elderly. He joined the United States Senate in 1996 after becoming the first senator elected in an all vote-by-mail election. He has taken the lead on policies to secure elections and further enfranchise voters by expanding Oregon's vote-by-mail system nationwide. With the threat COVID-19 poses toward the health of voters and American democracy, Senators Wyden and Klobuchar teamed up to introduce the Natural Disaster and Emergency Ballot Act. This bill would expand early in-person voting and no excuse absentee vote by mail to all states, and include new safeguards to ensure disabled Americans and communities of color have access to the ballot box during a pandemic. With that, I am truly proud to turn this over to my senator, Senator Amy Klobuchar.
For having the foresight to start talking about this really important issue. And I think Laura understands how important it is in my state, Senator Wyden in his state, and all over the country. And I want to first thank the National Council of Jewish Women for your leadership on so many issues, from reproductive rights to foreign relations on. And this is an incredibly progressive group that understands to make progress, you need to move forward. To make progress, you need to have elections. And none of the things that we've been talking about and your leaders have been talking about over the last few years are going to get done if we can't have an election. And I think you all know a number of primaries have been postponed for good reasons in places like New York and Ohio. But now we have to think ahead to the election in November. We can't let that be postponed. And there is no reason it should be when we have Democratic and Republican Secretary of States from across the country, 2 of them today joining together across the aisle, Arizona and Washington State, where they published a piece together to advocate for more funding to help states to allow people to vote from home, vote by mail. We already have very successful vote from home, vote by mail in many, many states, including Ron's states of Oregon, which is nearly all vote by mail, or my state, which uses it as an important part of our voting. And as Laura noted, I will like to compete with Ron here. Minnesota actually had the highest voter turnout in the country in the last election. We often lead the way, and that's because we just simply make it easier to vote. So here's our plan, and that is to immediately get funding to the states. We got $400 million in just this last big bill that we passed out of Congress and was signed into law. But we want to get even more so that they can pay for the ballots and the postage and everything else we're going to need as we transform the way that we vote. Secondly, we are asking that states keep their polling places in this legislation open for 20 days before the election. Why? And we're talking here about early voting, not every polling place, but just like you have in many of your states. Well, we know that less people will congregate if we do that. We're well aware that not everyone will vote by mail immediately in 8 months, and that's why we want to make sure those that don't do it that way or have to pick up a ballot do it in the safest way possible. And then finally, for those that do vote on election day, we want to make sure that we have the poll workers there. As you know, so many of our poll workers are seniors. And if we are sadly still dealing with the effects of this virus in November, we want to train a new generation of poll workers that can work there on election day. It's pretty straightforward. We're hopeful that we're getting support all the time. One of your major focuses of your group is to make sure that we have no voter suppression and we allow people to vote. And I can't think of something that fits more into your mission than working with us to get this bill passed and mostly get the word out that we shouldn't make people, especially our seniors, choose between their health and their vote. That would just be wrong. It also is helpful for younger people, actually, because so many of them, depending on what happens with their schools, colleges in the coming fall, could have a very difficult time figuring out how to vote when they have to register and the like. So we want to be ahead of this problem and follow the examples of a lot of states, red and purple and blue, that have really pushed toward early voting. One other thing you should know about that, there's about 16 states that have rules that make it harder to get absentee balloting. Now, you can do it in those states. You can do it everywhere in the country, but they just put a lot of requirements in place. Our bill would change that and make it easier for everyone. Also, states on their own could change their laws, so that's another way you could get involved in advocating for change. Lindsay Kerr, who's the staff director of my Rules Committee, is also on this call. I don't know if she can be unmuted, but she also can participate in the online Q&A afterward to answer some of your questions about the work that Senator Wyden and I are doing together to get this done. So I mostly want to thank you for everything you've done for our country, for our world, in advocating for such progressive policies, and let you know that there are a number of us that are standing tall and saying, well, maybe not as tall as Ron is, given that I'm 5'4", but that are standing tall and saying we have to be able to vote. And so I think you know that right now we're rightfully focused on things like getting ventilators to people and basic things like expanding testing. I just got the great news in Minnesota that Mayo Clinic is very close to rolling out a serum test. I've been working with them to get approvals that will allow people to know not only do they have it now, but did they have it in the past, and do they have immunities to it, which would be so helpful as we go forward in battling this very, very difficult disease. We're also working on being able to televisit to our seniors in assisted living and doing more with that. there's so much more we have to do, as well as, of course, stabilize our economy and get unemployment to the people that need it and bring our economy back again. But again, you guys have the foresight to realize we also have to have a functioning democracy to make any of this work. So that's why Ron and I are working in the next bill, in the next piece of legislation, to get more funding. This is also a major focus of Senator Schumer's and Speaker Pelosi's and a number of Republicans as well. So we're really excited about the work that's ahead of us and would love to have you on board. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Hi, folks. Ron Wyden here. Can everybody hear us?
Yes, we can hear you, Senator.
Wonderful. Well, I'm glad to be able to follow my partner in all of this, Senator Klobuchar. We've been a team on this issue, and I'm barely a household word in my own household, but I'm the minion maker in the United States Senate. So that is something I take great pride in, and I so appreciate the chance to be back with the council and to hear about your wonderful work. Here's what I think the bottom line is in terms of our challenge. I introduced vote-by-mail legislation for the first time back in 2002. So we have been at this for quite some time, and Senator Klobuchar and I have been teaming up to basically make the case in a modern sort of way. I mean, we know that there have been some who've had reservations about voting by mail because they thought, well, maybe some of those people aren't going to vote for us. Well, I think a lot of that is very debatable, number one, but what, in my view, this may come down to, particularly in the context of a pandemic, I believe we may be looking at the prospect of telling people the choice is either vote by mail or don't vote at all. And if those are the choices, I don't think that's a close call. I think that America will step up and say, first and foremost, we're about doing the right thing. And in terms of the partisan debate, I can only tell you that at the beginning of the vote by mail debate, Republicans were for vote by mail, Democrats were against it. Then I won the Senate special election, first Democrat in 34 years, and then the roles reversed and voters said, nuts on all of this, put vote by mail on the ballot, and then they voted for it and have liked the convenience and the cost effectiveness and the integrity that we require with signature matching and the like. The question for all of you is kind of how you go out and operate, in effect, as election security Paul Revere's, spreading the word in your communities, talking to your local elected officials, talking to the county elections departments. And it seems to me that one of the arguments we ought to be making, which I didn't have back in 2002, is we are no longer talking about reinventing the wheel when we talk about vote by mail. What we're talking about is largely about upscaling the status quo. I mean, so many Americans use absentee ballots. When we started this whole effort, the rules with respect to no excuse-based voting were really rigorous. I mean, you really had to have an excuse to get an absentee ballot. And a lot of that has gone by the boards. And so what we have to really do is make sure that people understand that every Tuesday now, certainly almost every Tuesday, another state is saying they're going to have to postpone their election. And you hear, well, is it going to be canceled? Is it going to be postponed? But practically every Tuesday, this has become almost a part of American life in an election year. In an election year when you have a pandemic that you wake up and on Tuesday morning you hear about another state in effect postponing their election. So I'm sure Senator Klobuchar told you that a big part of what we have asserted in all this is that Americans shouldn't have to choose between exercising their right to vote and putting their health at risk. And I want to give you a little bit of context to that. My background is working with senior citizens. I was director of the Gray Panthers for about 7 years before I came to public life and ran the legal aid office for the elderly. We know that something like 60% of the poll workers in America are over the age of 60. So picture this. Without expanded vote by mail and the kind of legislation Senator Klobuchar and I are working on, you could very well have an elderly poll worker, say a vet, visited at the polls by another elderly citizen who simply wants to vote because that was a big part of wearing the uniform in the United States for both of them, that they saw the franchise as something so special to protect in this unique system of self-governance that we have enjoyed for more than 200 years and is open and free and accountable. So I think those are some of the arguments that we ought to be making. I'm proud to be the nation's first mail-in United States Senator. The election, the special election was a completely mail-in election. And what we found is that after that first one, it did not become a partisan issue. In our state, nobody would ever let you take it away. Not whether you were a Democrat or a Republican or anything else. They wouldn't let you take it away. And now that we have had this pandemic thrust upon us, I think that we ought to recognize that if we just keep pushing, and Senator Klobuchar, I'm sure, touched on the fact that we made some progress in the stimulus bill, $400 million in new funding. We've got to make sure it's spent in the right way, and that's something else that all of you in the council can pursue as you go out and back to your communities. We've got a good chunk of time left to go before people get their fall ballots, and what we want to do is just work very closely with thoughtful advocates like yourselves, and I'll just close on a personal note. My parents fled the Nazis in the 30s. Not all got out. My great-uncle Max was one of the last gassed in Auschwitz. I never thought I would have these kind of opportunities for public service that I've had. And so to be able to be on the phone like this, talking to all of you who are working so hard at exactly what my parents thought America was all about when they fled the Nazis in the 30s, and my dad joined our military and wrote the propaganda pamphlets that we dropped on the Nazis. This is just a tremendous honor, and I've enjoyed meeting with so many of you over the years and being with the National Council in person. And let's just put this in the to be continued department, because we want to keep working together closely in the days ahead. And as Senator Klobuchar, I'm sure, told you, we are going to be relentless in pulling out all the stops to get this legislation passed and carried out and funded, and we do vote by mail in the right kind of way and not put Americans in the position of risking their health just to vote. Thanks, folks. Did any of you want to say anything by way of, I don't know if Senator Klobuchar took questions or anything you wanted me to know, but I'm happy to do that for a couple of minutes. But it looks to me like you've got a pretty busy schedule as well.
Thank you so much, Senator. We really appreciate that offer. We are going to keep moving, but I just want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you for making the time to be here today. We so appreciate all that you're doing.
Look forward to seeing you in person. Thanks for all you do. Bye now.
Thanks so much. Take care. So a big thanks to our senators for making the time to be with us today, Senator Klobuchar of Minnesota and Senator Wyden of Oregon. We really appreciate their work and their service, especially during these unsettled times. Next, we are going to move on to hear from two elections experts, Ashley Allison and Myrna Perez. Ashley Allison is the Executive Vice President of Campaigns and Programs at the Leadership Conference. Ashley brings over a decade of outreach, community organizing, and campaign experience, along with an expertise in crisis management, coalition building, and strategic planning. Most recently, from July 2014 to January 2017, she was the Deputy Director and Senior Policy Advisor under Valerie Jarrett in the White House Office of Public Engagement. Myrna Perez is Director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections Program and leads the program's research, advocacy, and litigation work nationwide. An expert on voting rights and election administration, she is the author of several nationally recognized reports and articles. Her work has been featured in media outlets across the country, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and MSNBC. Myrna has testified before Congress and several state legislatures on a variety of voting rights-related issues, and she is a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. She has also served as an adjunct professor of clinical law at NYU School of Law. With that, I would like to hand it over to Ashley.
I think Ashley's about to join us, so we'll come back to Ashley.
Okay, then in that case, Myrna, I would love to hand it over to you at this point.
Okay, I'm sorry, I tried to start my video, but it's not seeming to let me do so. I hope that that was as intended. Bienvenidos, welcome. I'm Myrna Perez. I direct the Voting Rights and Elections Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, and I'm very thrilled to be here. I have a number of things that I want to share, namely that we've got, as a community, as a field, as a nation of do-gooders and people who are change makers, we have a lot that we need to get done between now and November. Ashley is going to be going into some more depth about some of the things that can be undertaken, but I'm going to do a few parts of that. I mean, the first thing that I want to do is to explain what is at stake. We are having an election and a national election in a few months, and as all of us on this call know, the election is the way we resolve our political differences as a country. It is the way that we explain the direction that we want our nation to go in. And voters should not be in a position where they have to choose between being safe and between being able to cast a ballot that'll count. And to that end, a number of advocates all across the country at the state and federal level have been pushing really hard for some basic principles so that voters don't have to make that choice. There are different buckets in the voting pipeline for which we need to be focusing on, and I want to walk through those different buckets because I think that will help orient some of our advocacy. The first is voter registration. So I'm sure many of the people on this call do a lot of voter registration. We are in our neighborhoods, walking blocks outside our grocery stores, at naturalization ceremonies, trying to explain to people the importance of registering to vote. Obviously, that is limited now because of the physical distancing requirements that are now imposed upon us. And moreover, we're hit by that even harder because traditional methods of registering voters, like going into the DMV or going to social service agencies, are not going to be as available because those offices are closed and people are not getting out as much. So one of the ways that we as a community need to fix is the fact that we are going to have this entire swath of Americans who are eligible to vote but not are registered to vote, and the ways that we have traditionally reached them are not available to us. It's going to be an imperfect solution, but one of those is by expanding online voter registration opportunities. Many states already do this, not all of them do. It's critically important that in the states that don't, that these opportunities be available, and the technology to do that exists, but it's not going to be free or cheap. And so some of the funding that we need to go to the states has to be so that they can set up online registration systems. But that's not enough. They also need to be strong enough to be able to handle a load that they may not be used to, because there are these other mechanisms for getting people registered to vote. Like some of you may be aware of the fact that the online registration system crashed for a few hours yesterday in Florida. We can expect this to be happening, so they need to have the technological mechanism to be able to handle more people. And those of us that do voter registration or counsel people that do voter registration need to figure out how we're going to change our business model so that we're not actually talking to people and handing them a paper, but we're actually making ourselves available so that they can use these online options, or that we are mailing them voter registration applications if that's legal in your state, and helping them on the phone walk through it. So that's going to require a lot of public education and a lot of hustle, right? Like a lot of people getting out there and making sure that they're not using the traditional methods, but actually working even harder for every voter or every potential voter to get them registered and moving. Another part that I want to talk about is after the voter registration process, then what happens? We have all these election workers that we need to process pieces of paper. And those pieces of paper can look like applications to register to vote, but they can also look like applications to vote by mail. And if more people are able to be voting by mail, then we need to have people that can process those things, and they need to be able to do so in a safe way. They need to be able to do so in a quick way. They need to be able to do so in a way that doesn't impact folks because of signature matching requirements, or because people have language limits and the forms aren't done in a way that's easy for people to understand, or they're not designed well, or they don't account for the fact that people's first language might not speak English, or that people may have visual or physical impairments and therefore are going to need different kinds of assistance of requesting if we're moving more toward a non-paper system. Related to that is we as a country are going to have to figure out this issue with purges. You know, right now, if you have been purged and you show up to vote on election day, if everybody's following the law, they were supposed to hand you a provisional ballot. How does that work in a system where people aren't going in person? How do we make sure that we don't have mail ballots go out to addresses that have not yet been updated, or whether, and how do we handle the fact that some voters are going to need to present identification either because their state law has an identification requirement, or because they're a first-time registrant and they need to have ID because they weren't able to be found by the computer database systems that look through things? How are they going to be able to handle that without burdensome requirements and impossible hoops to overcome under a system where things are not happening primarily in person? Related to that, we need to be talking about how we're going to make election day work. We absolutely need to have polling locations. There are way too many members of our community that are going to need to vote in person. There are folks who have language limits whereby they are entitled under law to be able to have someone provide assistance. And therefore they need that kind of services that currently exist best at polling locations. There are people that have physical or visual impairments that require them to be able to use the kind of technology that exists in polling locations. We all know that Native American communities tend to have very different understandings of addresses in their community compared to what the post office says. And then we all know that some people have really, really unreliable mail systems. And to be limiting a person's right to vote on the kind of government services like mail that they get would just bake in inequality. We also, of course, are also going to have people who are homeless and don't have fixed addresses, but nonetheless have the fundamental right to vote and need to have in-person options. So how do we do this? What we know about this virus is constantly changing, but we do know some things, right? We do know that the voting needs to happen in places that have sufficient space so that we can do the physical distancing. We do know that we're going to need to recruit a new crop of poll workers, folks who are healthy and at low risk and can be trained to be doing different things. We do know that we need people who have like language capacity and people who are able to provide good customer service. And we do need people who are going to be trained as to the different kinds of mechanisms that are going to need to be involved in terms of sanitizing the polling places, in terms of making sure that people are waiting in line with the appropriate amount of safe distances, and have the problem solving and troubleshooting skills to make sure all of those things happen at the same time. And then, as someone's noting, how do we do all this with the threat of closing the post office? The threat of closing the post office is one of the really big reasons why we still need strong in-person options. And finally, we're all as voters and people who talk to voters and people who motivate voters are going to need to have some patience. If we are doing things more via paper than on in-person voting machines, it's going to take a while to process that paper. And we can't be expecting a result of an election 5 minutes after the polls close, because we need to give the mail system some time to work in and people to process those as ballots. So what I think this crisis has done, at least for me, if there were one silver lining, it would be that it has laid bare all those places in our electoral administration that we should have dealt with many, many years ago. This particular crisis has to do with the coronavirus, but everybody on this call knows that we have had tornadoes, we've had hurricanes. Next year, it may be Russian cyber criminals that are crippling our election. And the right to vote is too important to not have a plan for when something goes wrong. Like, we need to be able to have the confidence that the election that is going to go off in November is going to be smooth enough and legitimate enough and have enough integrity so that people can feel good about that being a way of deciding the direction of the country. And we needed these kinds of resiliency plans, these kinds of contingency plans decades ago. And now this is just forcing us to do something that we should have done a long time ago. I'm a civil rights lawyer, so that means I'm super optimistic that if we work long enough and hard enough, we are going to be able to make change. And I think we can, but the number one thing that we can all do now is, push to get states and localities the resources that they need, the financial resources that they need to do all of this very specific things that we're asking them to do. The money needs to come, and then from that money, we can go and do some of the specifics, but that is the absolute first step. We need to get more money to the states and local election administrators.
Okay, I'll jump in. Sorry you didn't hear me before when I was on the webinar. Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to join this conversation. For folks who don't know, the Leadership Conference is a coalition of 200 plus civil and human rights organizations. The Brennan Center is a member. National Council of Jewish Women is a member. And really our origin story is through and about voting. We believe we're stronger in coalition. Our organization was started by African-American labor and Jewish leaders, saying that if we fight the fight together, we will make greater progress and we will win. And when we think about the origins of the civil rights movement, it was about the economy, it was about voting, it was about justice, the same fights that we're fighting literally in this very pandemic. Myrna covered so much and was very comprehensive in what she was covering. I want to be responsive to some of the questions in the chat box, but also just say personally as a voter who has experienced voting by absentee when I was in Ohio, voting early when I lived in Ohio, and now that I live in Washington, D.C., not having reliable mail from the place that I lived in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, when I lived in New York City, and voting on election day. All those options were necessary for me as a voter. And I needed the choice to be able to decide which way was going to be the best way for me to participate. And I see a question about why people may be opposing the legislation. I try not to think about why other people don't want to support things, but rather think about why we should be supporting these. The efforts that we are advocating for, these are things that we were advocating for before coronavirus started spreading across the world and even hitting the United States. We wanted to stop voter suppression by expanding online voter registration, by expanding early voting, by making voting as easy as possible, by expanding options for people who want to vote by mail to vote by mail. But what our advocacy was ultimately rooted in is that we wanted to leave no voter on the fringes. We wanted to leave no voter behind. We wanted to make sure that every single voter that can vote, that is eligible to vote, can register. When they register, they get on the rolls, they stay on the rolls, and when they go vote, they can cast a ballot that is ultimately counted. That is more important in November than ever before. It's one of the most important elections of our lifetime. And so when I think about people who don't want to support this, it's because they don't want the voices of Black and brown communities, of Native Americans, of disabled people, of queer people to really be heard. And they don't want to listen to it because they're afraid of what people might be saying. But you're on this webinar, people are joining in this movement. We have calls every day, all day with different grassroots organizations just like yourself who are saying, we are gonna fight for our democracy because we have no other choice. Now we overlay this terrible pandemic that is unfortunate and people are losing their lives, but more will be lost if we don't get this advocacy right and we don't get this election right. And the one thing I would just emphasize is that while primaries have been moved, we have time to fix this. November is a ways off, and so we need people to be leaders and take action now. We need people in the House and the Senate to release the funding that states need to actually do these things well. We don't want to shortchange our election. We don't want to shortchange voters. So we need them to release the full $2 billion that is required to make sure that every state will have the money it needs to implement these changes that is appropriate for their state. Our next leaders that we need to really step up and lead are governors and secretaries of state. Each state is different. They all have different laws. The Brennan Center has done a great analysis of the different laws that each state has. So we need each governor to be vocal and the secretaries of states to be vocal and say, hey, we actually need this money to do our job right. Our country, our states, our citizens, our voters deserve this. The people living in this country absolutely deserve this. And then the final thing is that once you get into the states, each county is, they decide their laws separately also. So if you live in a specific county, you want to make sure that there's early voting and that there'll be drop boxes if they do vote by mail. And there are all the precautions that are in place to ensure that every vote is counted. And we have to start now. We got a fraction of what we needed in this last package, that relief package that was passed last week, and we're grateful for it, but we know it's not enough. And so we need to make sure that the states get the money that they need. And we can't wait, because if we wait until September, then there'll be talks about why we can't have a successful election. We know the problem now. We need to address the problem now. And if we do, we can have a fair and safe election, because the most important thing is that voters have their voices heard, but also that they're safe when they go to vote. I saw one question about how can we get people to vote online. We aren't advocating, and there isn't a way to actually vote online. What Myrna was discussing is that some states have the ability for people to register voters online. So to decrease the amount of in-person interaction that we often do around voter registration drives, it's online voter registration that we're advocating for, so people can do it from their home, and then when they are ready to vote, they can check and make sure they're on the rolls online, and then when they're ready to vote, they can actually go to the polls, or they can go and vote absentee. And we also know that online voter registration isn't going to solve all of our problems because of some of the broadband issues that different communities have, particularly communities that are often disenfranchised or suppressed through voter suppression. So I just want to thank everybody. I know we have a couple minutes left for Q&A. We need every single person in this effort with us to say release the money, to continue to make sure that the states do what they need to ensure we run fair and safe elections. We won't be able to do it without you. So thanks for listening, and thank you for all that you're going to do.
Thank you so much, Ashley, both to you and Myrna. That was really excellent information. So thank you for being part of our webinar today. We are going to keep moving from here, but again, do feel free to enter any questions that you have. Our staff will be happy to get back to you, and Ashley and Myrna will also be able to answer some questions as well. So thank you all for your interest in the very important sense of urgency that they helped us remember is our focus for right now. Next, we are proud to have 2 NCJW field leaders and Promote the Vote captains who are going to share how they are adjusting their Get Out the Vote work during this pandemic. First, we'll have Lesley Frost, NCJW Promote the Vote captain and Maryland Action Team lead, and she will be followed by Dr. Leigh Wallace Tabak, NCJW Promote the Vote captain and clinical professor at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Administrative Leadership. So Lesley, I would like to hand it over to you.
All right, I don't know where I've gone, but my voice is here.
Your voice is here, yes.
My voice is here, but my face isn't. You're better off that because I missed my last appointment with my hairdresser and it's already beginning to show.
Didn't we all?
Better off without it. So let me go on. One of the questions I saw in the chat room was about registering people to vote by using the web. My team and I had decided that we would get ourselves trained to register people to vote the normal way, and we went to the training and we were all ready to partner with our synagogues, the League of Women Voters, et cetera, to start this. And this whole pandemic thing began to hit. So the first thing that happened was that we couldn't do voter registration because we weren't doing that. And the first thing we did was we sent out emails to all our contacts saying, this is happening. If you haven't registered to vote, then you can register online by going either directly to your County Board of Elections or through NCJW, use the Turbo Vote link, and they will take you where you need to go and guide you through the process. We did that. And then the second thing that happened was the shutdown continued. And two results of that was one, that our General Assembly was adjourned. In Maryland, we only meet from January through April. So that was adjourned with some election bills passed, but some of them not. We're hoping that will pick up again in May so we can continue that work. The second thing that happened was that the governor made a few decisions, executive decisions. The first was that they would cancel our April primary and move it to June. Now, interestingly enough, I had already registered with Turbo Vote as a practice session, and I got the word from Turbo Vote that the primary election date had been changed before I got it through my other sources. So that's a big plus for Turbo Vote. They emailed me immediately. The first thing we did when we heard this was we got back on the email list and emailed everybody and said, okay, this is what is happening. Guess what? They've moved the election because of the virus. We don't know how long this is going to go on for. I suggest you all register as absentee voters. In Maryland, we don't have any barriers to absentee voting. You can sign up with no reason given whatsoever. The problem we came across this was with some of the people we've been working with in senior citizens' homes is that they're not familiar with computers and they didn't know how to do this online. Fortunately, we were able to give them the telephone number that they could register online by phone with the Board of Elections. So that's something that we have to keep in our back pocket for this. As part of the governor's proclamation when he moved the date of the primary vote, he also said that the special election in Maryland, which is being held in the 7th Congressional District, which is for the late Elijah Cummings seat, is to be held as an all mail-in vote. So we will have some practice in this state for doing mail-in voting because that is on April the 28th, that election. Our state board of elections is in favor of all mail-in voting for the primary. They haven't said anything yet about November, but our state board of elections meets this week and has to report to the governor this week their recommendations on having the primary in June as an all mail-in voting. They have a draft plan, but none of that, of course, is settled as yet. So what I see the role of myself and my team as being right now is being to educate ourselves on everything that is being planned for the primary in June, and to be a source of education, to do the education needed to make sure people understand what is going to happen and what their options will be for voting, which includes things, as our previous speakers have mentioned, like early voting, drop boxes, in-person voting for those who need it. Will there be return postage included, and all those other things, plus signature validation, which is always a big issue. I think that's all that we have thought about right now. We are working closely with several partners, synagogues, League of Women Voters, and because we in Maryland kind of spread a little bit into DC, we're also working with the League of Women Voters in DC, because there's no NCJW section there, to help them sort through the issues that DC is going to vote, and I'm not quite sure what's happening there. So that's where we are in Maryland. Our other, I think, advantage is that we are not a very big state. We have a population of about 4 million, and I think that is going to make it more manageable for us to promote and work for an all mail-in voting, both in the primary and in November, than it is for some of the larger states. I think that's all I have to say for now, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present our draft plan.
Thank you so much, Lesley. Really appreciate that. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Leigh Wallace Tabak.
All right, well, thank you very much. Certainly some wonderful speakers this afternoon, and a very difficult act to follow as we move forward. So hello, everyone. I too have the same issue that Lesley mentioned, but have tried to hide that just a little bit. But I really am happy to share with you what we are doing, or actually gearing up to do in our Milwaukee section. We actually, in the first week of March, had started getting the ground underneath our feet to really begin moving forward with our initiatives. We really in the Milwaukee area have a dynamic, committed social justice advocacy group here in the area. A group was recently formed here in Milwaukee called the Interfaith Voter Engagement Project, and we felt that that would really be a natural fit for us to begin working with and being a part of that particular group. They met with local leaders and advocates across faith groups and synagogues in early March to begin looking at how we could coordinate our efforts. Relationships during that particular meeting that afternoon were strengthened and developed, and really allowed us to start thinking about how we, NCJW Milwaukee, might engage our community in the PTV2 efforts. So we also, the next day, got together and went to a League of Women Voters training. Our leadership team engaged with them. It was really a full house for that training of lots of folks from across the Milwaukee area. Talked to them about preparing some training for our membership, to get our chapter, to get our friends and other folks throughout the spring and summer engaged in being able to do some voter registration. However, as we know that, the world has changed significantly since that first weekend in March. So as we started thinking about this, we were planning on involving our local social justice and advocacy leaders at each of our area synagogues and these other faith organizations. They really do have an active network, and they have a broad reach within the faith community, as well as in just their local communities. So as we start assessing that safer at home order that has been placed here in Milwaukee and in the state of Wisconsin, our leadership team is going to be reaching out, our members are going to be reaching out to these folks via Zoom or some other video platform, and have maybe what would be our virtual breakfast meeting or lunch with these different leaders of our social justice and advocacy committees at our area synagogues. You know, it's one of those things where we're going to have to bring our own bagels and coffee to the meeting, but we think that this might be at least a way to still meet face to face and have some discussions about how we can collaborate as we move into the summer and the fall elections. One of the things I'm most excited about is our social media strategy, and that's what we're calling our Members to Friends, or M2F initiative. This will allow our members to post coordinated and calendared messages over the social media platforms that we already use, or that our teenage daughters and sons may be using, such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, that will ultimately allow us to reach not only our membership, but our friends, because we certainly have friends that run the gamut in all kinds of different social circles, our old high school friends, our work friends, and so on. This will allow us to, again, get those coordinated messages out, similar to some of the topics and things that Lesley was mentioning in our little Twitter, you know, our tweet we can throw out, you know, have you received your absentee ballot? Have you registered to vote? Remember to do this. Poll workers needed. There are all kinds of messages we can coordinate at different periods of time. And if it's coming from, you know, maybe first we'll start with our board, 20 to 30 people, and then we expand that, we really have an opportunity to reach a large group of people. We even have our own handle on Twitter. It's PTV2 Milwaukee 2020, where we'll be able to put out these messages to promote the vote and protect the vote. And then finally, something I want to share with you, I think really is an initiative or a strategy that we can use, especially if we're you know, safer here at home, that we call the power of 20. And you can really use any number that suits you, 5, 10, 50, whatever works. But given our elections, this election coming up in November of 2020 is so important. If we think about the power of 20, that's a way for you to reach a large audience again. So if I commit to finding 20 friends that will write their legislatures, that will get their friends to write letters, then we have the power again of multiplying that. So if I find 20 friends, well, I'm a former English teacher and school administrator. I think if I find 20 people that then find 20 people, that allows us to have about 400 people writing letters, making phone calls, registering people to vote, whatever that might look like. So it's like the old shampoo commercial, you tell 2 friends and they tell 2 friends and so on. This is one way for us to really grow our voice and our impact exponentially during this time. So again, I'd encourage everybody to think about the power of 20, look at how we can expand our social media platform, and again, you know, these efforts will extend beyond November and will be things that we can implement across other initiatives and causes. And so thank you to NCJW for inviting me today and for initiating the Promote the Vote, Protect the Vote initiative, because I think that it can really be powerful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lesley and Leigh. It is so great to hear from both of you and to really showcase the strength of our grassroots power to fulfill our mission. Thank you so much. So with that, believe it or not, that is all the time we have for today. We have packed so much into this time together, and we appreciate you all being here. Before we close out, I do want to charge everyone with an action item. Try using NCJW's TurboVote tool. You can find that at ncjwvotes.turbovote.org, and we'll send this out afterwards to you as well. As Leigh was saying, this is a great way to activate your network. If you're in an NCJW section, you can work with your leaders to build out a phone tree. You can recruit volunteers to call every member of your section and use TurboVote to make sure people are registered and have the latest information about their primary date or whatever else might be coming up at their polling location. If advocates are going to vote absentee, this is a great tool to check if people need help accessing or sending back ballots, and TurboVote will send updated election reminders closer to an election date as well. So if you're not in a section or you want to do more, you can still, as Leigh mentioned, call 5 people in your network, like family and friends, sign them up for TurboVote, and then you can call 5 more. You can also stay connected while using TurboVote. You can expand your network and work with your section to maybe do a virtual voter registration party where everyone is using TurboVote. There are lots of great ways to use that tool. So we will share more information about TurboVote after the webinar, including a tutorial, so stay tuned for that. And I want to thank you all for joining us today to learn more about how we can protect and promote the vote during the pandemic. The recording of this webinar will be shared with everyone who registered in the next couple of days and posted to our website. And get excited for next week's webinar, What the Heroines of Passover Story Can Teach Us About Resistance Today. I'm really excited for this one. It will feature Rabbi Dania Rutenberg, and despite the fact that not a single woman is mentioned in the Haggadah, no less than 5 brave women open the Exodus story in the Torah. So each of them takes great risks to resist tyranny, and their stories show us a number of ways that we too can work toward a more just world. Thank you again to our speakers, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Wyden, Ashley Allison, Myrna Perez, Lesley Frost, and Dr. Leigh Wallace Tabak for sharing your expertise. And thanks to all of you for joining. I hope you will stay well, stay safe, and we will see you again next week. Take good care.